Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special edition of our Community and Values series of webinars with distinguished guests as panelists here. I'm Jeremy Haefner. I'm Chancellor here at the University of Denver, and it's my distinct pleasure to be your host and sort of MC for today's webinar. We really have, I think, a very exciting show, webinar for you lined up here in so many different ways. This is a community and values event, which I've been so pleased with over the course of the last several weeks of how the team has really offered interesting webinars and engagements through online platforms to help us come together as a community. And today's special edition community talks is all about our University of Denver values. And this launches off, I think, a series of discussions that we will have over the course of the next several months about those values that really define who we are and who we want to be as a university. It's incredibly important as we manage through this pandemic crisis that we're in. Before I get started, I would like to state that there is closed captioning available. It is available by clicking on the closed captioning button that you find at the bottom of your Zoom window down there. So please access that if that is of value to you. The Community and Values project really has two compelling parts that are relevant for today. Number one, it is designed to increase a sense of belonging through pragmatic community building that we're seeing, especially in this pandemic. And today, especially, we're also going to be exploring our values that will become our North Star moving through this crisis and onwards for this university. So please keep that in mind. I am so pleased to introduce our panelists today. I'm going to quickly run through the list, and then I'm going to turn to them and ask them to say a few words about themselves that isn't perhaps quite captured in their bio. So, and when I introduce them, panelists, would you please wave to the crowd so they see your face with your name? The first one is Wade Loo, who is a 1980 graduate of our accounting program. He's the current chair of our Daniels Executive Advisory Board. He's retired KPMG partner. He looks way too young to be retired. I'm just saying this right now. Also a board member of our Silicon Valley Community Foundation, of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. Grace Sullivan, well, she's our Swiss Army knife on the panelists because she does everything for the university. She's currently the vice president of the Graduate Student Association. She's a master's student in international and intercultural communication, and she's a staff member. She works in the Office of International Student Admissions as a credentialing evaluator and social media coordinator. Grace, it's great to have you with us. Johnny Ramirez, he is our iRise postdoc fellow. He's in his second year. He specializes in youth development and has interesting stories, I think, that will be shared in today's discussion. And last but not least is Allison Friederichs. She's the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Associate Teaching Fellow at the University College. She has research in how students learn, which I think is incredibly important in today's environment. So thank you all panelists for joining us today. And I'm gonna start by turning to Johnny Ramirez to just say a few words here. Johnny? You're muted, Johnny.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Johnny Ramirez, and feel real honored to be here to hold space with everyone in this virtual community. And wanted to open up just to kind of center the space. In a lot of my work as an activist scholar and critical race and ethnic studies professor, it's about building community. And we know that we're all part of the DU University community. But I think during this time of the pandemic, you know, it's really important for us to recognize that we all have lives and relationships outside of academia. and that all these environments and relationships kind of influence how we carry ourselves and how we move forward and what we bring in terms of our authentic self to this space. So at its core, being a critical race and ethnic studies kind of practitioner that uses knowledge and pedagogy with a transformative outcome, I think at its core, it's about creating space of empowerment and healing for our students, faculty, and staff so that we can be and bring our authentic self here. And I think what I'm holding on to was some words that Dr. Chris Nelson shared last week at our Teach-In to Teach Out series was, in a process to decolonize, as a process to change our relationship to the university and to learning, we have to see it as a verb. So we have to see it as taking action steps. So at this moment that we're in the pandemic, as much as we're going to talk about resiliency and hope building and our values, I think we need to take a moment to acknowledge that some heavy stuff has been happening and has been occurring. And in community work, when we talk about that, we talk about taking a moment to center ourselves, to be able to be in community with one another and giving ourselves the permission to be our authentic selves, sometimes in spaces that don't feel as welcoming. So what's beautiful about taking this opportunity to create community is an ability to connect to one another, even if we could do it virtually. So with that being said, I'd like to take a moment to do a land and community acknowledgement. So after I kind of make the acknowledgements, if you as audience and in fact, panelists want to take a deep breath and exhale as a way to kind of show that solidarity in action. So I've got my rattle right here. So let me begin. So we want to acknowledge and honor. First, we'd like to acknowledge and honor the land, the original caretakers of the land, the First Nations, specifically the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and the Ute, our native relatives that not only have ancestral connection to the land, but are here with us now. We want to acknowledge and honor Ahmaud Arbery, Brianna Bree Taylor, Jashwan Sean Reed. We stand in solidarity and action for them. Black Lives Matter, hashtag say her name. We want to acknowledge and honor the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is one of the hardest hit regions of COVID-19 with the loss of life with no basic community resources like running water, electricity, and hospital equipment. We stand in solidarity and action with Navajo Nation, hashtag Navajo Strong. We want to acknowledge and honor all of our Asian American brothers and sisters and children who are experiencing pandemic-related hate crimes and violence. Hashtag Stop the Hate. We want to acknowledge and honor all the caged migrant babies and children that are in the ICE detention centers that are being exposed to COVID-19 and losing their lives. We stand in solidarity and action to hashtag Abolish ICE. To all the prison inmates who are dying in mass graves with no access to masks, sanitizers, gloves, and medical treatment, we stand in solidarity and action to end mass incarceration. We want to acknowledge and honor all of our essential workers, grocery store workers, retail store workers, warehouse workers, truck drivers, migrant farm workers who are picking our food, workers that are majority working poor Black and brown folks that are risking their lives and their lives of their family members with poverty wages and no medical benefits. We need to stand in solidarity and action for all. A living wage and medical benefits are human rights. And lastly, we want to acknowledge and honor all of our first responders, doctors, nurses, hospital custodial workers, fire department, and law enforcement who are risking their lives and the lives of their family during this pandemic to keep us all safe. Hashtag stay home and save a life. Palabra, aho, o Mateo. Thank you, Jeremy.
Jeremy, I think you, okay.
Yep, thank you for sharing that, Johnny. Quite an acknowledgement, and I think it is important to acknowledge that this pandemic affects so many from all different corners of our community. I'm going to jump to Grace Sullivan. Grace, why don't you talk a little bit about yourselves and help the viewers understand a little bit more about Grace.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for having me today. I feel really honored to be part of this panel. Thank you, Johnny, for starting us off well. So I've actually been part of the DU community since 2008. I got my undergraduate degree here. And as has been mentioned, I'm part of lots of things on campus. So I'm really excited to highlight all the values I have seen throughout my time here, but also talk about some new values that have really been emerging the last few years that I think are just as important as some of our old traditions. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Grace. I'm going to turn over to my right, I guess, on the grid, or my left, I don't know. Wade Loo, you and I go back quite a ways and worked on the business advisory group. So say a few words about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I think you covered a lot of my background, but just want to remind everyone, so I graduated 40 years ago. And I've been very fortunate. And I really want to thank DU and the Daniels College of Business, because it helped me get prepared for a fabulous career at KPMG, and I was able to do quite well, and which led to getting on and serving on the Daniels College of Business Executive Advisory Board, as well as being a board member of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, which is the largest community foundation in the United States. And kind of what Johnny's talking about, you know, community and helping people in need, that is, we're deep in it right now here out in Silicon Valley, where I'm based.
Great. Thank you, Wade. And Allie, you know, you have the distinctive feature that you get my emails when I really mean to send them to Allison Riola, and I do apologize for that.
Not a problem. It happens all the time, and I was in good company. So, hi everyone. I'm Allison Friederichs. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs for University College. We are the University of Denver's Continuing and Professional Studies academic unit. I've actually been a member of the DU community since 1999, when I started my doctorate here in what was then called the Human Communication Studies Department. So I've played a few roles since then as well. I was a contracted lecturer for a while and have taught adjunct at University College, and been in this role for just shy of 6 years. So what's really cool, I guess, about my role and why I'm excited to be here today is that University College's mission is to provide access to the wonderful University of Denver for our adult learners so that they can have that same high quality academic experience that I had. And so I get to take the passion that I have as a DU alum and help ensure that our students have that same experience. So it's really bringing it full circle for me to get to share, you know, firsthand what DU means to me, and to see that reflected in our students and our learners, not just at University College, but across all of the University of Denver.
Thank you, Allie. And University College does a fabulous job. You really make us proud in what you're doing out there.
Thank you.
All right, so here's how we're going to flow. We've got a few questions that we're going to get the panelists flowing here on, but we do want the audience out there to submit their questions through the chat, and we have people who will help bring those questions back to me, and I'll share it with the group. But to just get it started, and Wade, I'm going to turn to you first. So, you know, these crises have a way of really, really testing us, both as individuals and, of course, as communities. We all respond to these tests in a different way. So I'd like to know from the panelists, what are you feeling personally? What are you seeing in our community as this COVID crisis has such a profound impact?
Well, I think you're right, Jeremy. You know, the fact that when you have a crisis or crazy situation, it really brings out the best or sometimes the worst in folks, right? And so what I'm seeing is that folks who have optimism and they show respect and compassion, they're the ones who are getting attention. And that's something that's really important, especially we're seeing a lot of individuals who are being very negatively impacted. And we need to be able to take care of some of those folks. And I live in an area that's considered one of the wealthiest in the country, and we're seeing some pretty difficult situations. So we need to be compassionate and make sure we take care of some of those folks. And that has really been a challenge.
I love that. I love that. Allie, I'm going to bounce around back down to you. How about you? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard from our students that our students juggle a lot to begin with. We've got students who are already juggling families, full-time jobs, and school all at the same time. And now having to do so, when you're dealing with the pandemic at the same time, it is a lot. And what I really feel personally is so proud that our DU staff and community have stepped up. I have seen the entire DU community, obviously I've seen more firsthand our university college staff, but DU as a whole, put our students first, really care about how is your academic experience. We know it's different right now, but how are you doing? Not just academically, but also personally and mentally and professionally, and caring about how students are navigating that crisis. I think we find ourselves as a university in a really interesting time where we know that the landscape of higher education was already changing, and this pandemic has probably put a finer point on that. So I think for me personally, I'm feeling a little nervous, but excited about what the future brings. I think now more than ever, the values that I would say are going to be important to us are the ones that have already started to emerge, which are inclusivity, tenacity, commitment, and resiliency.
Wonderful. Yeah. So we're going to have a lot more opportunity to dive into those. I love that. You've really got us thinking in that in the right direction. I'm going to turn to Johnny, and then we'll go back and finish up with Grace. So Johnny, you're up next. And you're muted.
Here we go again. In terms of the questions about what values that we're seeing displayed within the DU community. Oh, Jeremy, my question was, could you say the question again, please, so that
Absolutely. I'm sorry. I had to run and unlock my door really quickly. So this crisis that we're in, right? It's really testing all of us, both as individuals and of course as the whole community. And what we're wanting to explore is, how are you feeling personally, Johnny? And what are you seeing in our community as this COVID crisis really has this profound impact on us?
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Jeremy. Yeah. Like, I think, wow, I think it's, nothing that I could actually say I've ever experienced before, in terms of like, just, so much change that happened in such of a quick amount of time. How much, a lot of times when it's time where certain changes happen in your life or within, certain situations like your job or your education, you have to be ready to be flexible and move. And I feel like, on a personal note, it was really saying, okay, now you're going to go from teaching and being with students in classroom space. Now you're going to move online. Now you're going to, check in with family and friends and community virtually. And you're going to go into this whole other path that really kind of came about really quickly. So with that being said, it's like, okay, now these changes are going to come. And these moments of change is usually where your values and your integrity and the part of your character gets exposed, because at some point you're trying to make the best decisions in those situations. So I think for me, the core value that keeps on resonating with this whole pandemic is this indigenous philosophy called En la Quech, tu eres mi otro yo, you are my other me. And if I can get Tremaine to put up the poem really quick, I'd like to kind of share this poem. In my 20 years of doing youth work, I've recognized that when it comes to educational resiliency and keeping motivation and really empowering students to find a voice in their learning, that a lot of times it's not just the curriculum content that's challenging. It's actually the home circumstances, community, some of these environments and systems that our students live in, that as they get to their education, it presents some challenges. So how can we center ourselves, right? And how can our students and our community center ourselves to find support so that we can overcome some of those challenges and do it in a way where not only are we climbing, but we're extending a hand and we're helping other folks climb with us. So if y'all can roll with me on this, I'm gonna read the poem. So it's a Mayan philosophy poem that really centers how we can be in relationship with one another. It begins us to give us a start of a lens and a language to do that. So in Spanish, tú eres mi otro yo, you are my other me. Se te hago daño a ti, if I do harm to you, me hago daño a mí mismo, I do harm to myself. say te amo o respeto. If I love and respect you, me amo o respeto yo. I love and respect myself. And this kind of guiding lens has been a way that I've been able to build community with young folks and community members that at times systems have labeled at risk, systems have labeled, you know, troubled youth, you know, folks that have come out of reentry, out of systems of incarceration that have been system impacted, that this kind of grounding ourselves in community with this indigenous value and the recognition that my existence and my kind of path in life is gonna be directly connected to you. And I think in this case, I think this whole pandemic is in a way can be a teaching. I think in many ways, in a way as it's challenging and it's offering multiple forms of trauma, I think in a way to kind of transform it into healing or into medicine, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the pandemic teaching us? And for me, it just seems like every day that I put on my mask, every day that I think about our elders in the community, every Thursday when I sit with the young folks and we hold virtual circle, I'm thinking about all the privileges and opportunities that I have as a scholar, where I'm at, the ability to be in a safe condition, having a job to work, medical benefits. But at the same time that I'm owning that, I'm also thinking of my neighbors. I'm also thinking of the young folk. I'm thinking of my students that are part of the DU community. And I'm hoping that as we walk away, that value, that we are connected to one another. As much as in society, they want to silo us, especially in academia, we need to start moving past that and recognize that we are connected to one another. And to build a healthy community, I'll put on that mask, because for me, it's almost like an expression of humanity, compassion to folks. Even though scientific folks can have a debate whether the mask protects us or not, I think it's a good teaching to recognize that when we're in spaces that maybe we need to start thinking of other folks that we're in relationship with. So thank you.
Wonderful. I love that poem. That poem does speak to so many of us, and so it's really can be a flag for us in so many different ways. So thank you. All right, Grace, we're going to turn to you.
Yeah,
What's your perspective on that question?
I think I really echo all the sentiments that everyone else has already mentioned. And I don't know if it's raining and thundering where you are, but I can hear it outside my window, and that feels pretty much sums up what 2020 has felt like thus far. But beyond all of the, you know, unprecedented events and the anxiety and the isolation that I've been feeling and I feel from my community members, I also feel very introspective, taking this time to kind of, like what Johnny was saying, how can we learn, how can we grow, what makes up my core, and what makes me tick, what makes up the core of the communities that I feel responsible to. And when I really think about that, I'm really proud, like Ali said, I'm really proud of the agility that I've been able to show and everyone has been able to show around me, of just being able to pivot and make quick decisions for the good of the whole, and you know, really accept a lot of loss and sacrifice, but to still push forward. So I think that's really been kind of the lessons I've taken away from all of this, and what I've also seen in the DU community.
Nice. There's some wonderful words that you all shared in this process. Grace, you just shared agility and the ability to pivot, right? And Johnny, connectedness. Ali, you know, students and putting students first. Wade, optimism, respect, and compassion. So I think that's a really great way to kind of get us started and get us grounded in all of this. To the audience members, I want to again invite you to write in any questions that you would like to ask the panelists here in the chat box, and we'll make sure that we share those in just a couple of minutes. So let's really now start diving into the values. Ali, you kind of kicked us off and got us thinking about it, but the real question is, you know, there's personal values and then there's community values. So let's peel the onion back a little bit on that. As you go through your daily life with the virus, of course, setting so many new parameters, how do you notice your values coming into play? And are those values values that we have at the community, and how do you look at those two different different ways differently in that one? Let me start with you, Allie.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It has been, I would share the perspective of the rest of the panel to say, I mean, this has been such an interesting time to think about those exact things. You know, we find ourselves in this situation and we can make the best of it, or well, we cannot. And I think, frankly, most of us have been. And so for me, I think the personal value that does transcend into the community, there's a couple, but I think number one is just empathy. I've seen so many people think about other people first, and you know, have tried to think about our staff members and our students and the team I supervise, to reach out and say, you know, how are things going for you? How can we use the time that we're in to connect virtually, even though we aren't physically together, you know? And what I've really learned, and I don't know if this is a value, but it's the way that it's becoming kind of manifesting for me, is that community isn't a physical space. It's a feeling of belonging and inclusiveness. And interestingly, this time that we have found ourselves in has really shown a new light on that feeling for me. So I think that's how I would mostly characterize it.
Nice. I like it. Empathy. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me jump to Wade, and then I'll go to Grace, and then we'll go back to Johnny.
Yeah, so I would echo what Allie just said. You know, I think, you know, this empathy is important, but the other thing that I've noticed is friendship. And I think it goes, you know, both ways. You know, it's both community and personal. And what's interesting, and I may be jumping ahead a little bit, but all of a sudden, everyone's now accepting this virtual mechanism of connecting, right? So everyone's doing, whether it be a FaceTime chat or a Zoom chat or a Microsoft Teams, we're actually seeing more connectivity through this virtual mean. It's going to be interesting to see if this goes beyond, which I think it will, beyond the coronavirus. So that's going to be something that's very interesting in a good way. So to me, it's all about friendship. And if you do that, and I'm finding myself reaching out to more folks that I normally wouldn't do. I say, oh, geez, I haven't flown to DC, and now I'm doing virtual meetings, which is kind of neat.
Yep. That is very neat. Yeah, you know, it's interesting because you can get your extended family now on Zoom, and maybe you didn't have that opportunity up until now, and we're finding that that's a real delight in building friendship in a different way.
That's right. It's good.
Grace, what about you?
I think, again, that comes to the top of my mind is, again, agility, and watching the whole DU community really turn on a dime and try and pick up, you know, the pieces of what we were hoping to do, what we were dreaming to do in the future, and how can we reformat to make all of these dreams come true and really come around students. I know for all the organizations that I belong to, really at the heart of how hard we're working and how late we're working to be agile and pivot is really the students, especially for, you know, graduate student government. We really have had meaningful, robust conversation around what's our new role to support DU students, and what does that mean moving forward? And that brings me to my second value that I've seen rise to the top over the years, but is more important than ever before, I think, is valuing mental health of the DU community, of staff, faculty, and students, and whatever that looks like. I think when someone, you know, Zooms or Skypes or FaceTimes me and they ask me, how are you? It has a different tone. They really want to know how I'm doing. And I've really watched all the DU community do their absolute best to reach down to the core of what it means to be mentally healthy in such a different and strange time. And I think that's been really crucial and wonderful to watch, and what we'll need to move forward. Because I think a lot of things will be changed forever after this time.
I love that answer that you gave, you know, building off of agility, but then moving into the mental health aspect. You know, this university has an amazing set of assets and resources around mental health. We have specific colleges that really do an exceptional job at treating mental health behavioral challenges out there in the community, and we reflect all that. We think about that a lot. It's kind of in our DNA, and I really appreciate you bringing that into the forefront. We're talking about well-being in general, and that's certainly a big piece of that. Johnny, let's turn to you and see what your perspectives on your personal values and community values and how they interrelate.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I want to thank all the panelists for what they've been sharing, because I think I'm seeing a lot of connections, at least the way that I see this current situation. So when I think of like the need for us to be empathetic and to humanize one another, the need to have these friendship and community relationships, to have those as forms of support, those things put together, I think will, in a way, improve our mental wellness and overall well-being, right, as a DU community. I think I would just add that, like, you know, one of the values is at times figuring ways to put that empathy, that friendship and support and community and that wellness to actually kind of put it into practice, I think. So I think, you know, one of the values that I would hope to see is to be able to move in a direction where these values can look really concrete in terms of very material steps that could be done to be able to create spaces where there would be healing and more support. I think unfortunately, and I'm gonna, you know, keep it 100 and keep it real, that for communities of color in particular that have experienced marginalization, like the inequalities that our communities have suffered or experienced and navigate through, the pandemic has only really heightened and bring those structural injustices to light. And I think that's one thing that as a university community, we're going to start paying close attention to, that as our students are coming from the communities and families where they've experienced high levels of structural violence, of injustice, where, you know, I was just on an educational town hall last week for the Righteous Rage kind of movement for educational equity. And I was learning from the teachers out in Pueblo and in the San Juan Valley, in the rural parts of Denver, where a lot of school districts in inner city urban areas are providing a free lunch program where folks can drive by and get a bag lunch and stuff to kind of, you know, help families as they're, you know, figuring away. But in these rural parts of Denver, they didn't have the funding and folks weren't able to do that, you know? So, you know, it's kind of like, I'm hoping that what brings to light is that even though some of us might hold a lot of power and privilege and recognize that our resources are met, and maybe our mental well-being is better than others, I think we're gonna have to look at taking really concrete steps to recognize that we have other members of our community,
yep,
our native student community, our people of color community, our LGBTQIA community, our undocumented community, you know, our parenting students, like folks that carry identities that during this pandemic has made things even that much more challenging, right? So I think if we're really talking about well-being and stuff, we need to start to think about having those real courageous and hard conversations at looking at how campus climate, how oppression, whether it's structural or institutional, play an impact in that wellness. And I'm hoping that from the pandemic comes an opportunity. And the opportunity is to make some concrete changes so that we can say, hey, this is what it really means to put into practice when we say inclusive excellence or inclusive diverse education. And I know it won't happen overnight, but I think what gives me hope is our students. The students that have been in my critical race and ethnic studies classes are amazing. When they're giving these lenses and they're giving an opportunity to exercise their voice and their lived experience and experiential knowledge as part of their learning, transformational stuff starts to happen. So that's what gives me hope about the work at DU. Thank you.
So, Johnny, that was a great answer. And of course, a pragmatic approach, a concrete approach is music to my ears on this. I think we just really are at an opportunity or at a turning point on this campus where we just need to get things done in order for us to really move towards our aspirations on that. So you spoke eloquently and started to open up an answer to a question that we received from Seema Samini from Lisa Colin about the people of color who are disproportionately being affected here. So I want to come back to that question and give the other panelists an opportunity to think about that question. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to ask one more question to the broad panelists, and then we'll dive into these other ones that are there. And that question is, so we've mentioned a number of values here, whether it's mental health, agility, empathy, friendship, connectedness, concrete work. Now let's think about the crisis and how that crisis has really challenged some of those values that we hold dear, and really forced us to think differently around that. What the challenges that this crisis has brought to us in that case. So who would like to dive in first to that one? I'm going to open it up. I'm going to, rather than assign it, I'm going to let you just chime in here.
So, Jeremy, when we started, I mentioned, I think one of the values to me is optimism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you watch the news 24/7 or watch your computer or mobile device 24/7, you're not very optimistic. And so what happens, what I've been seeing is that depending all of the inputs that you have, whether it be the news or your mobile devices, affects your view of the world. And so I think it's important to achieve some sense of balance between getting enough information and too much negative information. And I see that with some of my colleagues and friends. And so that to me has been this constant barrage of negative news has been impacting us. And, back to what Grace talked about and Johnny echoed on the mental health. And that's a big concern.
Okay, so Wade, it just so happens that I got a question from the audience on optimism. And the question, I just want you to follow up with, if you don't mind. How can students or faculty or staff or anyone stay optimistic in a time of this complete uncertainty? And how can we find value in our work during this crisis? So what are some tips that you have for us for keeping that optimism going?
Well, long ago, when I first started working, someone told me it's never as good as you think it is, and it's never as bad as you think it is. And so I always keep that in mind. And so right now, when you're seeing all the negative news, obviously you just think the world's coming to an end. I'm not going to, for a student, for example, I will not find a job. But in these times of crisis, and we touched upon it when we started this call, there's opportunities. And I think it's up to the individual to say, hey, listen, I'm going to find those opportunities. And it's also up to the university and all of us connected with the university to help those students find the opportunities. But I think that is, you got to have an attitude saying, I will make this happen. I forget, someone mentioned action early on, maybe it was Johnny or Grace, I can't remember. But you got to take action. If you sit back and say, hey, I'm just going to let the things happen, then that's a bad situation.
Yep. I see Allie down there, so I'm going to jump to Allie here.
I'd love to piggyback on what Wade just shared, and I'm so glad that we're tackling this question that was shared by the community about optimism, because I saw it pop up and that one really resonated with me. And I think it does relate to the question, Chancellor, that you asked about what are the challenges. I think that one of the really unique challenges about the time we're in right now is that if you think about the way our life typically happens, is that we are constantly thinking about and propelled by this concept or this image of forward momentum. That's life, right? Is that we're always trying to get somewhere else. And we kind of don't feel like we have that right now. We all feel very stuck. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know when we're returning to campus, and if we do, for how long, because might there be another wave? There's so many unknowns right now, and that feels scary. And so people, it's hard to set goals. It's hard to think about what my future holds when you truly don't know what our future holds. So for me, I think that one way to just stay optimistic through this is, number one, just to remember, and Chancellor, you referenced this in one of the first letters you sent out to the community, that it might feel like this won't end, but it will. It absolutely will. The human race has gone through many trials and tribulations before, and we'll get through this one too. I have a favorite quote. As a matter of fact, I actually have it tattooed on my person that says, don't mistake the weather for the sky. And, for me, that's my way of remembering that sometimes we might look up and see, as Grace mentioned earlier, the rain and the gray clouds, and it feels icky, but that beautiful blue sky is always up there, and the clouds will move away. And as cheesy as that sounds, it is something that keeps me going.
I love
I'd
that.
to
I was just writing that down. Grace, what about you? You're ready to chime in.
I'm so ready. No, I really like what everyone has said. And I think sometimes it's not just the news that affects your ability to stay optimistic. Sometimes it's your reality. And for some of us, the reality has just been very, very bleak, particularly for marginalized communities. And it's not just the ability to turn off the news or, to turn off or tune out to bad and negative things around you. Sometimes it's your actual lived reality. And I think that we can't really sidestep how bad it has gotten for a lot of people in our very close circles and in our communities. And I think that being said, I agree, we have to go back to our core values. Who are your people? Who are your community? And how can you find consolation with them, through them? And that goes back to what Wade was saying, friendship, definitely. Who are your good friends? Who have your back? And I think that opens a lot of questions about how does the DU community have our students back, especially the ones who are really struggling right now. Maybe they didn't get the surplus funding. Maybe they're unemployed and they were working 2 and 3 gig economy jobs, which is true for a lot of graduate students, that they were kind of cobbling together their income. And now there's just nothing. And, besides just having really strong communities to turn to, what else can we do? And I think those are the questions we're asking right now.
Great. All right, Johnny, I'm going to turn to you. So the one question was, how has this experience of this crisis tested your values or the values of community? And then we riffed on optimism and what we might be able to help give our students or those that are struggling with this some ideas on how they can create that sense of optimism. So any of those you can tackle there for us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to take on that first part about like what has been challenging about the situation, I think is just that, it's presented an opportunity to really kind of say, like, to really reflect on how do you put the values that you hold into practice, right? Like, I'm definitely a community person. I love being in space with folks, with the young folks, to meet up with them, the handshake, the pound, the side hug, to be at family events and gatherings. I thrive in community. But right now, within the pandemic, that's really been challenged because now I'm looking to these virtual spaces as opportunities to kind of connect and stuff. And, to be real, like it still hasn't gotten there yet. The essence. That gives me, it isn't there yet. But I would say though that it's really challenged me to try this format. Yeah, hopefully I wasn't cut off. Yeah.
Just a little bit there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So hopefully, I think it was about like medium, and I'm willing to give this virtual space and these virtual tools that we're blessed to have to be able to connect. And I think one of the big teachings was a lot of my work with our undocumented youth and families, and thinking about how long that they've gone without seeing their grandma, without seeing their mom, or in a situation where it's only a phone call that they could have. And that unfortunately would experience loss, because that's happened a lot in the communities that I've worked in too. And not being able to have those traditional, roles and viewings and cultural that help in that healing process, right? So it's about like figuring out ways, giving yourself great to try these new things like virtually being able to do that. But with that being said, I think I would transition into the next step in terms of what would that look like for DU is going to be really some, I guess, again, Jeremy, some strategic planning, some funding that's really going to look at the wellness of our students when they back to the DU community and currently, even right now. So at some point when we come back to a community, just like Grace was highlighting, some folks are going to come with a bit of challenging experiences that they might be working through and healing from. And it would be so amazing to have a space and to have DU be that community where their education, their involvement in leadership, their organizing of programs and events, their ability to change campus climate would be part of that healing in medicine. Because I think a lot of times when we get to the point of us all coming back as a community, folks activating and exercising their agency, their power, their voice is going to be a way to actually uplift a lot of what they've been going through when they come back to the DU community. So my hope is that that's all welcomed, that it's all embraced, that we take that energy and we funnel it into say, how can we build? How can we continue to create spaces, and how can we build so that we can have this community be a place where all self is not just me as a student, but all my identities that I bring from home and my community to this space.
Nice. Okay. All right. So I don't know if the host is allowed to answer their own question, but I am going to throw one thing out. And as we talked about optimism, I've thought about resiliency and optimism, and while I'm not a scholar in that area, I do think that there are some concrete manifestations that we can share with others in that regard. And I think one of them is a sense of gratitude, and how do we manifest gratitude in a way that grounds us on a regular daily basis. And so that would be one little tiny tip to always say, what am I grateful for? What am I right now really grateful for? And I think what I'm grateful for right now, right this minute, is our ability to come together in this format, in this sense, and share these various different experiences and ideas and directives, if you will, and really put that out there for the benefit of our broader community out there. All right, so now I'm going to turn to a couple of questions here that came to us from the audience. And I'm going to try to bring some of them together. So there was, of course, lots of good questions about how our marginalized populations, our populations that are really struggling, hit hard. We know this from evidence that we've collected over the last 2 months, that the virus is particularly harmful to some of these populations. Johnny has talked about that so eloquently. And how do we really embrace a sense of values that will address those populations for us moving forward? How can this community and values partner in really making this contributing to give this sense of belonging and inclusivity? So bringing everyone to the table. I think this is it's a broad question, but it's one that's been lurking behind the scenes. So let's throw it open to all of the panelists here as well.
Jeremy?
I'm gonna, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ali, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'd love to take that one. I think a couple of things come to mind for me, and they did when Johnny was talking. Johnny, really appreciated what you shared there about this notion of really acknowledging the whole person. We are an educational institution, but we know, again, I have to say my community in particular is adult learners, and it's especially prevalent, I think, with adult learners and learners of color, that it's very difficult to separate the educational endeavor from all of the other factors that are going on in their lives, all of the other stressors that come into play. So we can focus on education and say, you have to try harder, but knowing that they have myriad stressors that are impacting their educational experience. And so I think to the extent that, and I don't think we should wait until we all come back together physically, but to the extent that we can, as an university, embrace all of the things and all of the experiences that our learners are bringing to the table, and understand that they do impact the academic experience. And there's one other thing I'll add to that. There is the concept of resiliency, which I think, frankly, is an individual concept and an organizational concept. And interestingly, the research on resiliency mostly has pointed to the fact that when we look at people who've been resilient versus people who haven't, even those who have been through the same types of experiences, there's not a lot of research that's able to point to what is it that makes a person resilient, but what research can point to are the characteristics that resilient people have in common. And so I think if we can find a way to harness those characteristics and apply them both at the individual and university level, that would set us all up for success as one big community moving forward.
Boy, do I want to talk to you more about that topic.
Love to.
Wade, why don't you weigh in, because you were about to say something.
No, I was just going to say that, I think obviously situations like COVID-19 exposes people who are disadvantaged, and it creates an opportunity, I think, for the university to see how can it play to help those marginalized communities. And I think, Jeremy, you touched upon it earlier, that mental health was a space that, DU is particularly strong and or has capabilities for research. I think there's opportunities where DU could be a convener of organizations, or at least exposing the issues, and helping educate others. I think that kind of thing maybe DU could play a role in, and then be relevant beyond COVID-19.
Yep. It's a great suggestion. And one of the, Allie, you talked about the whole person. There's been this conversation about resiliency and character and all these other aspects. One of the things that the university is moving forward on is a 4-dimensional student experience that I think really gets at well-being and the mental health issues. It gets at the character issues, the social, the emotional pieces to it. It gets to the professional kind of dimension, and of course the intellectual dimension. And all of these things that we've talked about today are really important to feed into that total experience. And I think it's a way to differentiate the university moving forward. Let's see, Grace or Johnny, do you want to weigh in?
I'd be happy to. I think something that I've kept mentioning, it was not my plan, but it keeps coming up, is just returning to the core of what makes you tick, to keep pushing forward. And that's kind of the source of my resiliency and the source of resiliency that I see around people. And I think to kind of blow that up to proportion as for the entire DU community, just remembering that every student is part of our core, regardless if they belong to a marginalized identity, and making sure that when we make decisions as a university, we're thinking of every student. And there's a place for all of these different, for lack of a word, all these different identities and ways of being, to be at the table when we make decisions. We're going to have to make really difficult decisions moving forward. A lot of us personally, and a lot of us in leadership positions, and just making sure that we don't forget that every student we represent is at the core of what we do, and not just some over others. And I think that's something that, even in my capacity working for the university, we've really been working hard to remember every last person that we serve, and how can we make difficult decisions, but with them in mind.
Great, love that, I love that, absolutely. What's in the best interest of all of our students? Johnny, how about you?
Yeah, like I think kind of echoing like where we're gonna really, when we think about the DU community in terms of like moving forward, in terms of like resiliency and stuff, I was kind of reading in the chat too that, I think it's important to note that at times the resiliency piece that we're talking about is not so that folks with marginalized identities be in a situation where then they're in their survival mode, and now they're forced to even exert that much more grit to then be able to put their head down and make it through. As an educational scholar, unfortunately, I know that a lot of these systems of education and everything aren't designed at times to take in the whole person. At times at its core, it's designed for folks that have been historically privileged, right? Economically, at some point, the systems of higher education were just designed for landowning rich white males, right? So we've done through creating departments like critical race and ethnic studies, by creating diversity programs and equity programs, there's been that shift in moving forward. I think we do have an opportunity, if we're really looking at the wholeness, because I want to learn a little bit more about the 4 dimensions you're talking about, Jeremy. But when we're talking about the whole social, emotional, like as a whole, I think that really thinking about increasing and expanding the critical race and ethnic studies department would be a way to start that kind of resiliency process, that empowerment process. I think as a community, there needs to be a space where we're able to connect with one another around having those challenging and courageous conversations about what is it going to look like when folks feel like they're inclusive and included and that there's equity. I don't want to romanticize that. That's a very difficult lift for that to happen. And the only way that I know that that's happened within communities is when students and DU community members would be empowered with those lenses and that language to kind of unpack and build community around that. So I think in many ways, we have an opportunity to really institutionally set the groundwork so that we're taking an education kind of scholarly approach to building up our students. Because one of our research indicates that for students of color in particular, that ethnic studies type of pedagogy and framework does result in positive social emotional learning outcomes. And I think a lot of it has to do is because when you come into those spaces, you actually feel that you bring all your experiences from your community, your family, your cultural identity, your gendered identity, your citizenship identity, you bring those social identities into the space. And then you figure out, where's our connection to one another? How do we build as a community? Like, what does it mean for me to stand as an ally in action with other members of our community that might be struggling a bit more than others? I really look forward to seeing DU take it a step in that direction, because then I think we're talking about sustainable change over time, that we're going to build the next generation of leaders that are going to exercise these lenses, put them into practice, really embrace justice and humanity. And as a university, DU can stand in that tradition that historically, that's where a lot of that growing happens, is at the university. So I look forward, and my hope is that that's where DU will go through kind of like this process of transformation and be a place where a lot of students are going to be like, I love being at DU because I feel like I can express my voice. I feel like I have a connection to community, and I feel like my education has so much more meaning, and I have a desire now to go back to my community and build.
Yeah, I love that. I love how we're addressing all these various different aspects, but I keep hearing students kind of rising to the surface here and our focus on students. I always tell the folks that I work with on a regular basis, if we focus on our students at the end of the day, if we really focus on our students, we can't go wrong as an institution. And I believe that, and I believe the institution is doing exactly that. We are almost at the very end of our hour. We have so many questions, unfortunately, that we didn't get to, but there was one question that I want to share a little bit of information on, because I can do that. And the question was, can you address what the university is doing on the small and large scale to help students who are currently ineligible for funds from the Department of Education or stimulus funds due to undocumented status? So as you know, the CARES Act, which is the stimulus that the federal government recently passed in Congress and signed by the president several weeks ago, that money has arrived at universities across the country. The University of Denver has received 2 tranches of money that was really meant to help us recover from the crisis. One of those tranches was directed right for students, and so it went right into the students' hands, and we're in the process of disseminating and distributing that money. But unfortunately, the Department of Education did not allow that money to go to DACA students, to undocumented students. So the university has made sure that other available funds are at the fingertips for our students. We have, of course, a very wide and discretionary use of a student emergency fund that has made a significant difference in the lives of our students. We're thankful for those who have contributed to that fund and made it possible for us to help some students really address some of the shortcomings that they've had during the coronavirus. We've also set aside more financial aid exactly for this kind of purpose, for those students who have this really important need that all of a sudden grew, and we want to help them to reduce that need as well. So there is some additional financial aid that is being set aside for all of our students, but particularly our students of high need in that regard. And with that, I want to thank our panelists, Grace, Johnny, Wade, Allison. You know, your passions, but more importantly, the principles and the values that you brought into this discussion were palpable. I think they speak to the whole community in a way that resonates deeply with all of us in attendance. I just love some of the words that I was trying to write down quickly while you were all talking, whether it's resiliency or optimism, respect and compassion and empathy, really being concrete and moving forward, putting students first. The poem, Johnny, that you shared, I think is one that should be put on the website for our community and values one. I think it speaks to all of us in so many different ways. I can't thank you enough for a lively discussion, one that struck right to the heart for our community and kicked off our discussion on values in such a meaningful way. To all of those of you in attendance, I thank you for being a part of this. I do want to hope that you will join us for another webinar that is scheduled on May 20th. It's going to be another great conversation celebrating one day for DU. And in that, we'll be joined by three really outstanding DU alumni who will talk about one of my favorite topics that came up today, resilience in the face of adversity. So please join us for that webinar on May 20th. We'll be sending out more information shortly. Thank you all for joining us and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you all.
Take care.